session of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. My name is Sophie Neiman, and I'm a reporter covering conflict and human rights across the African continent, most recently from Sudan's Nuba Mountains in South Kordofan. As a journalist, I think I understand firsthand how very overwhelming the statistics about Sudan can seem. War there began in April 2023 when disagreements over power sharing between two generals descended into open conflict. And now, as the conflict enters its fourth year, some 9 million people have been displaced within the country and another 4.4 million beyond its borders, in what is now the world's largest displacement crisis. Drones, meanwhile, are the leading cause of death in the country, causing 80% of civilian deaths in the first 3 months of 2026, according to the United Nations. Women and girls have been directly targeted, with rape used as a weapon of war. And amid these systematic killings, just mass displacement and widespread violence, some 17 million women and girls are in need of humanitarian assistance. That level of suffering seems almost incomprehensible. Senseless both in the scale of loss and also that it is literally difficult for us, sitting here in New York or watching online, to comprehend. My job as a journalist then is to make real the unimaginable. I traveled to Sudan in February. On the ground in South Kordofan, which has become the center of the conflict, it was difficult to find someone who had not been impacted by drone strikes. Soldiers and civilians who had lost arms were covered in hospital beds without access to proper prosthetics. Parents spoke about being unable to bury their children after they'd been killed by drone strikes while living in refugee camps. Meanwhile, another teenage girl told me she had been raped while fleeing the besieged city of Kadugli, now living in an isolated displacement camp with her family and without access to proper food. Through all of that, I think it is well worth noting that the Sudanese people have shown incredible resilience. I recall sharing an iftar meal at sunset with a displaced family who were giving what little food they had to their neighbors, and met husbands and wives in displacement camps who had searched for each other after being separated by war and then been reunited. But at the same time, this is a war that shows no signs of abating, all well fueled by external support, both to the army, the Sudanese armed forces, and the rapid support forces. The distinguished speakers here today, present, can help us understand the causes of this horrific conflict, its impacts, especially for women and girls, and what the legal avenues to accountability might entail. I'll briefly introduce them to you. Namat Ahmadi is the founder and president of the Darfur Women Action Group. She survived the Darfur genocide, which took place between 2003 and 2005, and has more than 23 years' experience now in policy and emergency response, while working to amplify the voices of those impacted by conflict. Koskondi Abdul Shafi is an advisor to the Darfur Network for Human Rights and a research fellow at the Holocaust Memorial Museum's Simon Skojot Center for the Prevention of Genocide, focusing on inclusive governance and peace building. Olivia Mooney is a program manager at the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, which generates the vital evidence needed to aid in response to humanitarian crises. From the Sufan Center, we are joined by Nikki Layubarsky and Gabriela Tejeda. Their center seeks to provide analysis of urgent security issues. Finally, Jihan Henry is a human rights lawyer and Sudan country director at the Reckoning Project, where she leads investigations into war crimes with the goal of building accountability for atrocities. Welcome all, we're so glad you're here. And to all our attendees, welcome as well. Thank you for coming and for engaging with this important issue. I'll begin with Namat of the Darfur Women Action Group. Namat, how has sexual violence become a systematic pattern in Sudan's conflict?
Well, thank you everyone, and thank you for Global Rights Defense for organizing this event and for the opportunity to address you. Unfortunately, speaking about Sudan entering into its fourth year of the vicious war that started in 2023, and speaking about the how the war impacted women. Actually, it has been a war on women's bodies. The violence against women and attack on women has been the most defining feature of this war. The incidents that occur in the outset or onset of the war was attack on women. The first incident reported in Khartoum around noon of the start of war was a rape, a case of a 12-year-old girl. In my hometown, Kabir, the first person shot was a woman peacefully walking to her garden when the rapid support forces started attacking the army headquarters and the surrounding areas, who was reportedly killed. So that is how the attack on women. Women have been abducted in masses. Nobody knows their whereabouts until today. Many women have yet to return home or reunite with their families. Unfortunately, not just they're being abducted and brutalized, but they have been kept in conditions that are unimaginable. There are some women who escaped. They said they were kept to render domestic services and they were used as sexual slaves, as have been beaten when they are resisted and then cut in their body with knife and burn cigarette on them. This is this is the simplest act that they have faced, but there were more brutal action that were torture that women have to face. It has been well also documented by both the fact-finding mission and the UN panel of experts that women have been subjected to rape, all forms of sexual violence, and sexual slavery, forced marriages. Unfortunately, we don't see the outrage, and the conversation it's fading out, and there is no sense of accountability to women. In our own documentation, like in the places where we provide safe spaces for women, there are women who were brought with incidents of brutal sexual violence that mount into the cases of Vistola. And this is in crisis situation where there is no access to reliable health services. There are women who have been shot because they resisted. And we have seen in the work of the attack in al-Fashir how women have become the first target because simply they stayed around to help other people survive, because they stayed around to help their families, to help their elderly and their children, and they will become the first target. In the previous war, there have been incidents where women and children have been killed, but there hasn't been a systematic way of attack on women, including both by using sexual and gender-based violence to terrorize women, but also killing women directly and abducting women, including also arresting women civil society leaders, women who are frontline defenders, including the recent incidents in Niala and in many other places. In Khartoum and Umdurman, in the early days, women have been arrested and abducted in masses. So you can imagine the level of suffering and this is happening due to impunity. In the early crisis or genocide in Darfur, the ICC has confirmed that rape has been used as a tool of genocide. Unfortunately, accountability has yet to be pursued for most perpetrators, with exception of Ali Koshe. One of the arrest warrant element of al-Bashir is a genocide, and that also he has ordered and enabled rape as a tool of genocide. He has yet to be brought to justice, and that it is sent a really a wrong signal. If it worked for him, then it will work for the generals and for the militia and those who are doing on the ground. There is also another form of attack on women, and it's the crime of gender nature that not being discussed often, because we have seen recently as the rapid support forces abduct and arrest women, even as they gather to talk about their own issues and their community's humanitarian need, but also staff in another side. When women are accused of being collaborators, even sometimes falsely accused, there's no evidence, or either they collaborated under pressure or under threat, like people come with guns and bombs. Women are arrested and faced with harshest sentence, including between 19 to 20 years in jail, and some of them has faced death sentence. While when men are defected, and we have seen the members of the rebel support forces who have killed people, commit genocide, raped women, abducted women, they defected and joined SAF, they were celebrated and regarded as heroes. And this is not a part of the conversation, but it has to be a part of the conversation, because this is not allowed for women. Like when women are just accused, going around neighborhood giving water to the militias or any actors, they were accused of being collaborated. Women remain in these areas because they are forced to stay in these conflict ravaged areas, and they were frontline defenders. So both sides have targeted women in a way or another. It is kind of gender, like targeting of a gender nature, that also using law against women or using force to silence women or to stop women from doing what they are doing. And this is something that they have not been discussed. And I think the problem is that the impunity that has been associated with this attack on women, but also lack of intervention that empower women. When attack happen, usually the traditionally international aid organization and also UN agencies, they will come with the traditional response of food, water, and shelter. But women priority and emergency need has not regarded as an emergency response. And that is the gap that left if women are not treated immediately, if they are not protected, and they're given what they need at the spot, then women, it is hard for women to be able to participate in decision making or even pursue accountability in the future. So these are also the gaps that exist. And then when the international community, regional or national actors talking about issues, women are not brought in the forefront of decision making. And this is also including by the humanitarian actors. When they decide on these humanitarian issues, women are not brought. And sometimes when they are brought in a superficial manner, or women from like historically dominant civil society, whereby women who are in the high conflict concentrated areas like Darfur, South Kordofan, and the Blue Nile are left behind. And so if they are not part of the decision making, then their priorities are not being articulated, and their responses are failing to meet the women's needs. And that is kind of like what is the current situation in Sudan. We have seen like a huge failure in Sudan. Humanitarian fund is failing to allocate enough funding for women in places like Darfur and South Kordofan. There is not effective like responses or funding that deployed to meet the urgent need that women face as of today. And then women human rights defenders from these areas are also left behind. So it's a combination of failure from all sides, while women being the main target. I will stop here and will be happy to answer your question down the road.
You use the word impunity many times, and you also speak about the failure of the international community to intervene, especially when it comes to the needs of women. What type of support, on one hand, humanitarian or otherwise, is needed to address the lifelong consequences of these types of assaults? And on the other, what types of mechanisms need to be put in place to ensure accountability for abuse and an end to impunity?
Well, I think there are, as you asked, there are like two types of responses that are immediately needed. Is that providing emergency response to women needs. Sometimes simplest things like dignity kit, like emergency health treatment, emergency surgeries for women who are facing cases like such as pistol, when people are cut off. In many cases, sometimes previously the traditional responses to women need, like NGOs do not provide like transportation for women to relocate to other areas to receive treatment. So these are the things that are missing. Sometimes $100 can save a person's life, but if you can't afford that and you don't have that, So local organizations are left to struggle with responding to this kind of needs and integrating this to the emergency need of, and sometimes like women-led organizations, they talk about efficiency and about the capacity, but the only capacity in the face of the crisis like one in Sudan is the capacity of an NGO to be on the ground and be able to respond to the need of their community. And that is what it is right now. There are like hundreds of organizations that are not visible at national level or maybe internationally, but they are right there on the ground delivering aid that is needed. They have access to people, they know their people, they trust them, and they can be able to render service, but they are not regarded as efficient or as like organization with enough capacity to receive the funding, and that is kind of like re-victimizing the victim at the same time. Number two, documentation. Like if no matter how serious the crime it is, if we cannot document the crime, we cannot be able to respond appropriately because you won't be able to determine the need on the ground. And then if you can't determine the need, also you cannot determine the future capability of this person to pursue accountability, because when you document incident, you will identify the perpetrator and level of harm that the survivor experienced, and rendering services to the survivor, enabling them to claim their right, and then also document atrocities with an intent to pursue justice. And if this is not available at the spot, at the time when incidents, when attack happened, you know, waiting 10 years, 3 years, 4 years to come on the ground and document atrocities, some people end up dying without receiving that justice. Some people move around and they may end up being traumatized and giving up the right to seek justice. And in many cases, if women are not part of the decision making, whether those justice mechanism or any other mechanism, then also they will be left behind. If you are not in the table where people make important decisions, then that's why we advocate for women to be included in the justice mechanism, not as victim and witness only, but also as advocate and expert and policy shapers. That is the only way to make sure that women are present everywhere and that they are shaping these responses. And then like empowering women, economic empowerment, like even though it is a crisis situation, but it's also sometimes like failing to remedy the harm and taking so long to respond or taking long to pursue accountability that makes survivors, like in a way or another, they are denied or either neglected the right to justice. And then this will also embolden perpetrators. They feel that it is okay for them to commit such crimes because there's no outrage, there's no seriousness from the international community, there's no recognition for the victims or even an attempt to empower the victim to seek justice. And so these are the responses that are needed, and there need to be a specific funding allocated for humanitarian response, but then also different type of funding for women empowerment and empowering women-led organization, as well as funding for accountability. There, for years and years, we work in accountability among a few organizations in Sudan that are prioritizing accountability for the entire victims of atrocities in Sudan and in Darfur specifically. There's no funding available. We have to do it on our own resources, and sometimes we have to do it voluntarily, which takes like a lot. We do documentation with intention of pursuing accountability. We also do documentation to raise for advocacy, to raise the profile of the issue and bring attention, but then there is no funding whatsoever for accountability. Most funding are appropriated for large, well-established organizations. They're not on the ground and they're not supporting the locally led. So I think there is a need for paradigm shift when it comes to addressing women issues. It's not just a theoretical, special way that we are discussing in nice rooms, but there is the need for practical step, empowering those like diaspora organization, women-led organization, affected community-led organization, because they do, like organization like Darfur Network. I remember today vividly when I had this discussion with Muhammad when he was thrown out of the country and came as a refugee to Uganda, and he was asking how he can help, and the best advice to give him was like, go to school and establish an organization. And here he is. Like today, he used his own resources to establish an organization. Today, he's documenting atrocities across Do they have all the funding they need? No. So that is the question, a big question mark that we have to put, and we also have to advocate for the donors, for member states to make that priority, and also using other measures, like we have advocated also to use sexual and gender-based violence in conflict as a standalone criteria for sanction designation of. And I also think another accountability measure is to determine that nobody who is responsible or enabling sexual and gender-based violence should ever be allowed to serve in government or be part of any like political settlement. So unless we make that harder for the perpetrator, women will continue to be victimized. With all of this, women are not helpless and they are not victims. They try to rise again and again, but they are let down. They are let down because of lack of responding to their need, but also integrating their voices and supporting them, allocating enough funding for them to do the work that they are already doing. Thank you.
Thank you. That was powerfully put. And as we speak about the scale of this violence, I want to note clearly that UN fact-finding mission has noted that RSF is guilty of crimes of genocide in Darfur, to underscore what Naimat has so powerfully shared with us. But as we speak of accountability mechanisms and the empowered role of local organizations, I want to turn to Koskondi of the Darfur Network for Human Rights. Koskondi, can you help us understand what is happening on the ground in Darfur, which has been the site of so many grave abuses, and how this reflects the wider patterns of impunity in Sudan?
Yeah, thank you so much. And yes, today I will be speaking on behalf of the Darfur Network for Human Rights, and also I am speaking on behalf of them because we cannot be able to have Mohammed come to America these days. And that's also another unfortunate situation where Sudanese human rights organizations are facing. In the beginning, you mentioned it about numbers. When we are talking about crisis of Sudan, then I'm always reminding people that we are not talking about the mass displacement, largest mass displacement in human history. That was 1947 in Indian partition. No, we are talking something larger than that. We are talking something more larger and devastating than 2013 Syrian displacement. We are talking with 14.5 million human beings. It never happens. In documented human history, nothing like this happened. So we are talking of a crisis of a new criterion of magnitude in terms of atrocities. And with the same scale, when we are talking about the context in Sudan, we are talking about a small geographic place in the size of France. Within the last 3 years, we have 2 genocides declared. And still we are talking about resource to document. We are talking about mass rape. We're talking about an entire city with a population around 200,000 people hanging on the balance of death for 6 months, confining. We talk about this in the UN, everywhere in the world, and we all watch them fed on and die. So we are talking about something that is different. And for me, this reflects, and especially like organizations like Darfur Networks, and Naimat talked about in the past many years working on Sudan, doing the documentation, seeking for justice and accountability, knocking different doors to open for at least to fight and combat this nonsense impunity that happens. And nothing happens. And I think all of this group are still working, and still. I was reading the quality of the report, like Darfur Networks, documentation of al-Fashil. hundreds of people in a container. And they just squeeze it there, they're dying every day, they bury 17, tomorrow 20, and you know you're there, you're dying. People who came and testified, and I think this just tells us, and I'm saying this in a very genuine perspective. When it comes to the case in Sudan, and accountability and justice, it is not lack of evidence. It is absolutely a lack of political will to act on the existing body of evidence. It is well documented, people on the ground, and we have the Yale satellite, they're actually doing further confirmation. We can see real time things unfold, see blood on the sky using the satellite. So the evidence is there. There is a lack of political will. What we want to try to deconstruct what is wrong with this and how this could change. How do we reframe this narrative around these mass atrocities? And as Sudanese, we find it very difficult. And one of the intrinsic motivation, as Nimad said, and I used to work as a senior advisor at Freedom House, and we had one of the largest human rights programs that fund this group, flexible funding, work on the field, pair the human rights monitors who are taking a bike and go in the front of the conflict to actually take videos, documentations, those who capture any audio, video pieces that share it in the groups of perpetrators and put them together as an evidence, reanalyzing. Those who actually go and interview the mass rape victims and talk to them. But suddenly all this money is gone. There is nothing. And still, even the limited resource that some of these groups have is the relationship that looks within the international is more of a risk transfer than a genuine partnership for supporting local voice, which itself is exploitative and it is, not fair. And I think, the biggest challenge that I think, and I would say this because I think why when I have a conversation with some of those groups that we used to fund and now they don't have money, but they still work and they live in Uganda, some of them are in Al-Fashir, some of them are in a very risk. And for them, documentation is part of resistance. It is part of resistance. They don't want to forget. And when the last report, Mohammed Hassan and the Darfur Network were doing interview, they were interviewing those who survived this mass killing in Al-Fashir. And there is this young boy who's like 17 years old. And basically, he's a minor. You cannot interview. He went there and he took his mom's hand and said, okay, she will be here when I'm talking. But I want to say what I saw, what happens to me. And I think that shows something new, something different, the commitment. I think what we want to urge is that the nature of the conflict, this conflict is not 2003 conflict, where you have an state using the ethnic divisions and paramilitary to ignite ethnic lines conflict to commit mass atrocities. What we have now in Sudan is a proxy war fully funded and responded from the outside actors. And it is very difficult. When we are trying to figure out, in 2002, there was the biggest story of fear of the world was because there was 2 million people displaced. Now we have 14. We had genocide declared, yes, in 2006 after UN fact-finding report has come out. But now we have Junaina and we have Al-Fashir. Probably we will have Marra Mountain in the next few months, who knows? And the risks are high, but there is no political will. And we're trying to figure out, is this also because of the international influence? Is this because the external the actors like the UAE are not like people in Al-Fashir or in Sudan? They can't buy a military contract, or they are not going to give you a check for $10 billion programs for a political success for any Western governors. They are just people who want to live in their land. So they don't matter as far as you have it. And I think we're trying to figure out where is the problem? Why don't the world be able to act at least to control some of this unending, insane support to the violence, to the atrocity that happened in Sudan? So I think it is very much, very much painful to see this. But I think what gives me hope a lot is that, people are seeking justice in a different ways. And generally, when we're seeing the magnitudes of the atrocities that happen in Sudan, either that is in Darfur, either that is in Kordofan, which is at the moment happening in a very, very high scale, either that is what happens in Khartoum, that are very, very deep wounds that are still not open, either that what happened in Al Jazeera. It is hard for us to say, a single mechanism like in the ICC can solve this, can address all of these problems. Meaning that we should be innovative as well in looking for justice and accountability. Explore different mechanisms where maybe less resources are needed, where the avenues are important, and why I'm talking more about fighting impunity, because I see an accountability even within when it happens at this moment, where the atrocities are happening, where it's high likelihood of more atrocities to happen. Actually, if we try to expand the accountability for some of these perpetrators, it actually can play a deterrent factor for those who are going to commit, because they know there is a consequence. Currently, in regions like Darfur and Kordofan, it is an absolute statelessness. You have you and your gun, and there is, a trillion amount of different types of drugs. It's a drug epidemic. And people just warlord, you just kill and commit as much atrocity as you, because you don't think there are a consequence for tomorrow. Any acts that we're arguing that capture some of these criminals, they are coming to Nairobi, they are traveling, they are leaving, capture them, arrest them, hold them accountable. At least that is the moment when they stop and think, yes, I do this as group, but in the end, I will be individually accountable for what I'm doing. And that at least will play a key role into at least influence as a deterrent factor to stop this atrocity. Otherwise, I think because we are going to more chaos, and as well 2 days ago and yesterday and day before yesterday, even in Darfur, we had that conflict that where mostly happens, and this is, and this is what takes us back to Nimat's point. Because the war has an ethnic aspect. The more you humiliate a woman from the other ethnic group, including raping, mass raping, and documenting, you are also is part of collective punishment to the other groups. And now we started to see this war taking also different, even within the RSF. And in the past 2 days, we have a new reignition of the Salamat Bani Halba war. And this is a war that is typical. It never happens in the history of the conflict in Sudan. That war that have used sexual violence as actual tool, where the soldiers go to attack and arrest the women, and they make a video while raping, sending to the other tribes. And this war started again 2 days ago. And we don't know where that dynamics will go, meaning that the conflict, as far as it goes, the more the statelessness continues, the more the impunity continues, the more the dynamics of the conflicts and atrocities have been changing throughout the time. And this is in the conflict in Nuba Mountain now that it started. It never happened since 2011. The factions fighting each other, the same that happened within the RSF, the same that could happen in a different location, in different place. A total militarization and open borders with the flowing arms of different types, and a complete absence of any sort of governance systems of accountability. So the risk looks very high, and the future looks very bleak when you're seeing in this aspect. What we're seeing is that the resistance of the local actors, despite the absence or the very, very, very low resources they have, despite a global silence and lack of support, they are keeping up and trying to show that this is what is happening, this is what we saw, and showing to the world what happened. I think what we want to think, and I don't know how to say that, but I don't have any idea how this will happen, but I think we need to change some of the narrative around this conflict. If otherwise, it's hard to make a breakthrough. It's been 3 years. We're talking about 30 years of this, and we're talking today of policy frameworks that now exist. None of them looks any promising so far. So I think we need to change some of the narratives.
You spoke so movingly about the human cost of this statelessness in Sudan. I want to zoom in on one thing you said before we move on to the rest of our panel. You talked about documentation as resistance. Sudan is known for its deep civic engagement, from community kitchens to the exact type of documentation you spoke about. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that documentation done at the civic level looks like? And as well, I would say, as a journalist who's covered this war from Kordofan, one of the greatest difficulties I faced was feeling like I could only be a witness to atrocity. So perhaps as you speak about this community documentation, how is it also perhaps being used in accountability mechanisms?
Yes, accountability takes very different forms when it comes to atrocities that are taken at this magnitude, but also taken as a social communities. These are not people like coming from different countries to do this. These people also live within some of those communities that they commit the atrocities. And I think the one key role that actually documentation plays, like every testimony collected, every evidence archived, every victim interviewed, is an act of accountability. Why? Because nobody commits crime. How powerful it is that we want people to know. And every evidence that collected, is people knows that what they did. And I think within that aspect, most of the videos that I share, you have people, you sit here in friends in the US, others in Europe, they actually say they see these groups, put all of these people and, put their guns and they're killing them. And they actually knows all of these people in the video. This is your uncle, this is your auntie, this is your relative, they have been killed. Okay? And actually, you remember the people, the names that are repeated, the people who committed the crime, and you try to figure out who were those people who were there. And I think that is where sometimes I think the local accountability takes different aspects, meaning that if you have this evidence, you can actually be able to look for this person, find it, and you expose it. Even if there is no global justice and accountability mechanism, the documentation plays a very key role into, first of all, alerting the perpetrators that people know he was the one, or he was the commander, or at least what he did. First. Second, it also gives the victims a very empowering voice that, okay, I know what happens, people know what happens. The third is that even after justice and accountability or whatever happens in the future, I think those documentation can play a key role for healing, reconciliation, and other forms of remembrance and accountability. And that is which is very important as well to the local actors. So I think the accountability takes different forms, but in all forms, to happen, you need the truth. And to find the truth, you need to have an evidence. And I think that is what is important for that.
On the note of truth and evidence, I'd love to turn to Olivia Mooney of the Yale Humanitarian Lab, which works to gather some of the empirical data we need to respond in these types of crises. Olivia, can you take us through the process of open source data and satellite imagery analysis? What does this actually look like in practice, and how is it being applied to a place like Sudan?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Pleasure to join these distinguished panelists. My team at the Humanitarian Research Lab uses a combination of what's called remote sensing data and open source data. Remote sensing is a catch-all phrase that refers to data that is collected remotely by sensors, and so this primarily means by satellites. When we're using remote sensing data, this data can include satellite imagery that looks something like what folks take a look at when you're looking at Google Maps and zooming in over a neighborhood that you're looking in. And it also includes things like thermal sensors that detect fires and other forms of data. When it comes to open source data, we're using a range of sources, including from those here on the panel. Thank you so much to Darfur Network for Human Rights and Darfur Women's Action Group. We're using data from organizations that are releasing reports. We're looking at data from news organizations, and we're looking at photos and videos circulating on social media as some of the primary data that we're using. So our team takes these two parts of data and we combine them in a data fusion methodology, which pretty much just means we're looking to see if we can corroborate or see the similarities between the two data. So in terms of videos of attacks on civilians or an attack on a hospital, we can then see the hospital and see damage before and after that hospital was damaged. And so together we build a body of evidence that is meant to strengthen the reporting of local journalists, local groups collecting data and evidence on the ground, and provide a basis of factual data that can be used to enhance accountability and advocacy and the work of those organizations who are collecting that data and putting themselves at harm's way.
Thank you. How might this type of data collection specifically support claims like the United Nations conclusion that rapid support forces were guilty of genocide in Darfur, for example?
So our team focused most significantly on al-Fashir, on the siege of al-Fashir, which took place from April of 2024 and cumulated with RSF's control of the city and mass killing in October and November of 2025. During this time period, we documented first the systematic raising of communities around al-Fashir. These communities included predominantly Zagawa communities that were the breadbasket or provided a lot of food for the city of al-Fashir. We then documented the rapid support forces' systematic attacks on communities throughout the city as they slowly moved and destroyed the entirety of the city. By the end of 2024, we identified the presence of advanced weapon systems, and into 2025, advanced weapon systems including artillery and drones that were used to support the rapid support forces' attacks on al-Fashir, and it provided evidence of foreign support to those actors. And then we documented the building of a berm, or an earthen wall, around the entirety of the city. This earthen wall was one that was approximately 75 kilometers long, and it is something that is typically used as a defensive mechanism. This was something that was incredibly concerning to us because we were seeing what is a typically defensive mechanism, a wall to prevent forces from accessing the city, used in a way that was offensive and targeting civilians and preventing them from being able to flee. So by the end of the conflict, and the city was entirely surrounded by a wall, civilians were limited to a single neighborhood inside the city, and they were being systematically attacked. Each one of the internally displaced persons camps, Zamzam, Abu Shuk, and Al-Salam, had been attacked and destroyed. And we'd been able to corroborate that by identifying munition impacts and the destruction of buildings, by identifying and seeing where civilians had fled to, by seeing the pattern of life or the types of vehicle and person and animal activity that we were seeing in the city disappear and be limited to that very small region of the city. Now, the totality of that evidence corroborated the United Nations fact-finding mechanism report that came out in February of 2026, called Hallmarks of Genocide. And so it was not necessarily just the final days of the siege of al-Fasher, which are most notable for the violent attacks on civilians, mass killing of likely tens of thousands of people, but it was the sequence of events that led up to that. First, starting by destroying the breadbasket and attacking communities, slowly destroying small neighborhoods from the east to west, preventing civilians from being able to access the city and flee the city safely, and finally encircling them with a wall before executing people en masse as they fled for their lives.
Thank you, Olivia. That's heartbreakingly and powerfully put. You spoke about this sort of systematic violence in al-Fasher specifically and the trends that your work there revealed. Can you speak about wider trends you've also observed throughout your research on Sudan, including attacks on critical infrastructure like the hospital that you mentioned, or evidence of foreign backing through drone strikes or other attacks?
Thank you for that question. So there's two major trends that our team is continuing to document, and since the fall of al-Fasher, we've seen a significant investment in foreign support to both sides of both parties in this war, the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. We're seeing this manifest in the form of drone attacks or UAV attacks on areas across the country. Now, this is a significant development from the start of the conflict even, when the only air force that existed was a traditional air force that was from the Sudan Armed Forces that was using what's called line of sight targeting, in which they're dropping munitions, they're flying over areas and dropping munitions to target communities, to target critical infrastructure, etc. Since January of 2025, we've identified the presence of advanced weapons, including advanced drones in the control of the Rapid Support Forces, and since then also expanding across Sudan Armed Forces, systematically targeting infrastructure across the country. So instead of the front lines where the areas of control are being heavily contested, seeing the primary violence and the destruction, we're seeing this happen across the entirety of the country on a daily basis. Areas from Tina on the westernmost part of Sudan and as far east as Port Sudan, the northeast border of the country, have sustained drone attacks on critical infrastructure, including hospitals, markets, schools, etc. We're seeing that this war is being conducted against specifically civilians because the targeting that we're seeing overall is targeting the civilians' ability to live and have safe homes, seek medical care, etc. We've also identified the presence of advanced weapon systems, primarily in the hands of the Rapid Support Forces. These advanced weapon systems include drones such as the CH-95 UAV, which is a type of advanced weapon that is likely produced by China and supplied to them in other ways. We've also identified the presence of and support to the Rapid Support Forces through Ethiopia at the Asosa Ethiopian National Defense Base, the National Defense Forces base, in which we're seeing the presence of light technicals, so the types of trucks that forces use being moved to those areas and then distributed likely up towards the Blue Nile front lines, including Kurmuk and those heading towards Agdenizim.
Thank you, Olivia. So many of our panelists throughout this conversation have spoken of the involvement of external actors in supporting both parties in Sudan's conflict. Specifically, the UAE has in the past been accused of supporting the RSF, and Egypt and Saudi Arabia of supporting SAF. But we're really privileged to be joined by two analysts from the Sudan Centre, who can help us break that down. And so now I would like to turn to them. Nikki and Gabriella, the UAE, as I said, has been can you break down this web of often confusing external actors who have supported both parties in the conflict and what their motivations are?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us here. Oh, thank you. Thank you for having us here to talk about this specific aspect. specifically when we're talking about the very dire humanitarian crisis that's happening across Sudan. The work that you all do is very important in shedding light, and although the proxy aspect of this is certainly very, very integral to the conflict, the humanitarian aspect on the ground is really one of the most vital aspects of this conflict. And so to kind of start to get into the web of all the external actors that have a part in this conflict, I think it's maybe important to highlight why they are interested in Sudan first. Many of you mentioned the UAE. Saudi Arabia is also interested in this conflict, supporting the SAF, Egypt as well. And then Libya and Chad are involved as border countries, and as many of you know, Sudan borders 7 countries, and it also shares a long border with the Red Sea, which is a geopolitically important corridor, not just regionally, but internationally as well. The U.S. Has always shown interest in the Red Sea, and so have countries like Russia, which is where you also see their involvement as well. But beyond geography, there's also this aspect of the very arable land that Sudan has that is made, unfortunately, unable to use because of the conflict. But the Sudan, in times of peace or relative stability, can serve as a breadbasket for the Gulf, who cannot produce their own food, and so it is important. That is why it's one of the many reasons why the UAE, Saudi Arabia specifically, is very interested in Sudan. And of course, beyond geography, beyond land, we'd be remiss to not talk about the mineral richness of Sudan, and specifically the gold trade, which the UAE really has its hands in. And I think Gabby wanted to talk a little bit more about the UAE and its relationship with Sudan's gold.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. As Koskondi so passionately put the plight of the Sudanese people, I think it's important to highlight that the severity of the Sudanese humanitarian crisis is really a product of paramilitary forces with independent revenue streams and external weapon suppliers and a networked regional support base, which Nikki highlighted a little bit for the RSF in terms of Libya, Chad, and Ethiopia. And in effect, this has turned specifically the Rapid Support Forces into a hybrid regional actor capable of prosecuting a sustained war. And I think that it's really important to highlight just how entrenched the relationship between the Rapid Support Forces and the UAE really is. They've had a relationship for quite some time now, especially in 2019 during the Libya civil war, which the UAE also had its hand in, and the RSF acquired combat experience and weapons and strengthened its ties to the UAE. But I think what really ties together and is central in the RSF and UAE relationship is gold and the gold smuggling pipeline from Sudan to the UAE, which has really created a financial windfall for the RSF to stockpile weapons and reduce its dependency. And I think, Koskondi has also emphasized, a proxy war that has been different from what they saw in Darfur in 2003. And so I think that also pulls in Saudi Arabia, because the UAE and Saudi Arabia has for some time had a lot of tensions, especially in terms of proxy wars. You can look at Yemen, which is another example. And Saudi Arabia sees, supports the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, not just because the UAE supports the Rapid Support Forces, but also it sees the SAF as more of a stabilizing force in terms of Saudi Arabia's own development. Saudi Arabia is just across from the Red Sea from Sudan, so I think it sees, especially in terms of Saudi Arabia's own development, specifically its Vision 2030 economic development plan, They see the SAF as a more reliable source, especially as they try to develop their tourism and trade hubs. So I think that that's also a pretty important aspect as well.
Thank you both for helping make sense of something that is deeply complicated. Given the international interest in gold, the fact that Sudan in times of peace can be seen as a breadbasket, countries trying to secure their borders and keep a stable government in Sudan, all of these competing interests converging on this one country. Should this in fact be seen as a proxy war, or does that undermine the conflict that does exist between SAF and the RSF?
I think in many ways it can be seen as a proxy war because neither, well, especially not the RSF, but neither the SAF as well would be able to operate the ways that they are without the support of external forces. The RSF, it gained, as Gabby said, it gained experience in combat in Libya, but without the UAE supplying weapons and opening up supply routes through Libya, through Chad, the RSF would not be able to commit the crimes of mass atrocity that it commits throughout Sudan. And with the Sudanese armed forces, they also struggle to fund their war as well. They are constantly looking for revenue sources. They are constantly looking for weapons flows. They've turned to Saudi Arabia, to Egypt, but they've also turned to Russia, which is an interesting player in this as well, used to support the Rapid Support Forces through its paramilitary group, the Wagner Group, but has since turned to the SAF because it views it also, similarly to Saudi Arabia, as a stabilizing, or as a relatively stabilizing force that it could use as a foothold to the Red Sea. And so in many ways, it is a proxy conflict. I think the conflict between the SAF and the RSF is driven by each group's own political desire, but they are enabled by external actors.
Thank you both. And then finally, how is this sort of presence of external actors shaping conflict on the ground? In my experience, the clearest sign that external actors were deeply entrenched in this conflict was just how ubiquitous drones had become, especially in the Kordofan region where I was working, when previously there wasn't a particularly formal air force in Sudan. From your experience in researching this so carefully, what are the impacts of external involvement on the ground?
Yeah, I think that you brought up a really good point with the drones, and I think that that's probably the biggest impact that you could probably say in the Sudan war. Drones have taken the war to an entirely other level in terms of civilian casualties and mass destruction, and that would not have been possible without external actors and their funding in purchasing the weapons. As Olivia mentioned, a lot of them are Chinese drones. We've seen Russian drones. Ukraine has even had a hand in providing drones for the Sudanese armed forces. And so it does take the war to another level. And I would also say, not to diminish what's happening in Sudan, but I think that the impact of external actors is also weaving together conflicts that might otherwise be separate in the region, in terms of tensions between Ethiopia and Eritrea for Red Sea access, and Egypt and Ethiopia, as well as Somalia and Somaliland. So it's really, it's creating a larger impact than probably we would have otherwise seen.
Thank you so much, both, again. Finally, we turn to Jihan of the Reckoning Project, with whom I would like to discuss legal avenues to accountability amid this horrific conflict. Can you begin perhaps by giving us an overview of what it looks like to specifically build the evidence you need for legal cases against perpetrators of violence in Sudan?
Sure. Yes, thank you. Thanks for letting me be here with you all. My identity is usually as formerly Human Rights Watch, so it's nice to be having this new identity. But I point that out because I feel that they are very similar and they very much echo what Kuskundi was saying before about documentation and the importance of it. My work with the Reckoning Project is with Sudanese. We focus on Darfur, and we are working with Darfuri human rights documentation experts, activists, and we've been, following, documenting to the highest legal standard that we can, all of the sort of main pressing human rights themes that the team has decided are the most important for them to follow. And of course, sexual violence is very prominent among the work. So are many other things like arbitrary detention and kidnappings for ransom and airstrikes with drones. So we are collecting testimony through very careful interviews with people in Darfur in various ways, using remote methods, but also in person. We do have access to people inside who are trained, and we also can reach people who are in refugee settlements in Uganda and Chad, especially. So we're able to do this documentation work, and I just want to emphasize the importance of what Kuskundi said about documentation as being in and of itself a form of resistance and a form of justice and preservation of truth. So I know your question is about evidence and legal proceedings, which I will get to, but in the context of Sudan, and I've been working, in and around this situation for 20 years now, justice is very frustrating. The wheels go very slowly. The ICC didn't deliver quickly. So there are many reasons why people are skeptical of the use of courts when it comes to responding and promoting accountability. During the years that I worked with Human Rights Watch, the methods of that kind of organization is very much using the public domain to press parties and to reveal the extent of the violations and the work that all of the panelists on this panel have described so well. And we've seen how that has changed in 20 years as well. Now satellites and other forms of technology are so much more pervasive in the theater of this war. So my point really is that documentation in and of itself is critical. There are going to be many different forms of justice. We do still talk about transitional justice, even those of us who were following the transitional period very carefully in Sudan, and it was so disappointing that it didn't yield more in transitional justice, but people in Sudan are definitely talking about needing to be prepared for some kind of mechanism, whatever it is, and the need to be creative and innovative when dealing with questions of justice. So with that, I'll sort of turn to the nuts and bolts. In terms of actually, getting material that is good for proceedings, I'll take a step back and say, well, what are the avenues? What are the avenues? In the past, we would talk about courts inside Sudan. There were special courts that were set up, and they never worked out. The Sudanese government set up special courts for the atrocities that happened in Darfur 20 years ago, and they were completely shambolic. And I think today still, most of the people who I'm working with, my small team, and my colleagues and maybe people on the panel would probably agree with me that the courts inside Sudan are not equipped to deal with the scale of the atrocities happening now, whether you're in the SAF-controlled area or the RSF-controlled area. And so then what are the options? Well, the UN has a fact-finding mission, which is sort of like a commission of inquiry. And this fact-finding mission is gathering information and documenting the way many of the Sudanese organizations are, but it lacks staff, it lacks Sudanese staff. It doesn't have the kind of resources it needs. And it also doesn't have the power to prosecute. So it's more about creating these repositories of information. When we think of actual courts, right now the main venue for Darfur is still the ICC. The ICC does have jurisdiction over the area of Darfur. One of the interesting or sort of very alive conversations since the beginning of this war is whether the ICC can expand its jurisdiction to deal with all of Sudan. And there are people who are advocating for the ICC to consider doing that on the basis of the original UN Security Council referral in 2005, talking about the situation in Darfur. The argument is that because the war in all of Sudan involves the same actors, i.e. the Janjaweed of yesterday are the RSF of today, same actors. The SAF of yesterday are functioning in the same way with the same individuals. So the same actors. Now the war has spread all over the country, but there are patterns of the violations, the atrocity crimes are very much in the same line as the original situation that the UN Security Council referred to the ICC. So there are arguments that have been made, legal arguments, and I think the ICC personnel who attended some of those discussions have said that they keep an open mind. The idea of currently working on Darfur, so expanding the jurisdiction temporally to today's war, that's not very controversial. They are indeed investigating what's happening in Darfur, focusing mainly on El Fasher and El Janina. But the geographic jurisdiction, the expansion of that is what I think is still quite controversial. But that it is something that I would support and that my former human rights organizations would also support. So that is an avenue. Now the other avenue that you may hear about, that people will talk about, is universal jurisdiction, and that is the system whereby another country's prosecutors are willing to prosecute an individual perpetrator from Sudan because of the international nature of that crime. And because their own national laws do allow for the prosecution of these serious atrocity crimes. So there are many dozens of countries around the globe that have these statutes, and Sudanese civil society in this sector of human rights documentation and legal accountability have been talking about that as well for years, since the war started. Now there isn't anything official happening yet on that, but it's good for people interested in justice and accountability to keep their eyes and ears open on that and see whether there are ways to support. Fundamentally, the best way to support justice is still doing this kind of documentation work that the organizations on this panel have described. And as I mentioned, my team are doing it in Darfur with the idea that this is also a form of truth-telling, and that preservation of these testimonies, the collecting of these testimonies, is in and of itself an important act. I will say one last thing maybe before pausing, which is back to the ICC. I mentioned earlier that it's so slow, and it didn't really, I feel anyway, in my own experience, speaking to people, did not really give them a sense that justice was being done. Eventually, in 2020, the ICC did try one person who was wanted in the Darfur file, and that's Ali Kushaid. And Ali Kushaid he turned himself in, and he was eventually convicted. He was not a Sudanese government official. He was rather a militia leader, and he was convicted of crimes that occurred in West Darfur between 2003 and 2005. What is remarkable about this case is not just that it was the first case in relation to Sudan after 20 years, but it was also a crime. There was a conviction for crimes against humanity, persecution that included gender-based persecution. So rape and sexual violence were among the convicted counts. And this is something that I think can bring hope for those who seek justice for gender-based violence and sexual violence, which have, as Niamat so eloquently put it, that has basically defined this conflict. It has been a huge feature, and as well 20 years ago in Darfur, so that this aspect of it is not exactly new. The case against Kushayb brings some ray of hope for some, but I think it also has been criticized because the sentence was considered low in relation to the crimes committed, and it will be interesting to hear from Niamat and others maybe on their reflections. It is also the case that the prosecutor dropped some of the charges so that those that stuck are in relation only to some of the locations where the crimes occurred, not all the locations. Now the case is in the phase of consultations for reparations. And reparations will depend entirely on whether the trust fund has enough funding to pay them. And I believe that the sort of expectation is that they would largely be done in the form of community projects rather than individual reparations, and this is a conversation that's also very much alive and ongoing now. So these are some of the thoughts that I can bring on the whole area of justice and accountability, and I hope I'll pause here, but I'm happy to weigh in more if there's something specific that comes up.
Thank you so much. That was very astutely explained. I'd like to zoom in a little bit on the Ali Koshayb case before we open questions to the group. How does this potentially set a precedent for future convictions, given that, as you say, the same people are involved as were involved in Darfur in the past? And related to that, how might international proceedings then translate into a domestic justice process?
Well, I think in terms of whether the Koshayb case sets a precedent, some of that depends on this question of whether the ICC is going to expand its jurisdiction, and also, what are the current investigations going to bring? Now, there are already several individuals who remain at large. We have 4 other people, and Ahmed Haroun, the former governor of southern Kordofan in the Nuba Mountains, where you just were, has been very much implicated in this Koshayb case because those 2 cases were linked. So where is he? Can he be handed over? What about al-Bashir? What about Abdurrahim, the former defense minister? So those cases are not complete. And then we have the new war. The ICC has accepted the extension of temporal jurisdiction, so it is indeed investigating, particularly in El Fasher and El Janena. Both of those locations have been determined by different entities to be genocides, at least partially. It's hard with the language because sometimes they say hallmarks of, sometimes they say episodes of, but in any case, the word genocide has definitely been used by UN and US officials in those 2 places. Now, those 2 places are in Darfur, and that is where the last genocide occurred, and that is the subject of the ICC. As to the rest of Sudan, there may have been there were atrocity crimes committed all over, and as others pointed out today in Kordofan and Blue Nile. So, whether or not the ICC will look at that is another question. So apart from the ICC, I think your question is also, could national trials come about? Well, as I alluded to before, I think there isn't much faith in Sudanese courts right now to handle this kind of stuff, this kind of crime. There has been a hope, always, for years, that some sort of a peace process, some sort of a transition would bring about the creation of a hybrid court. This was a conversation that happened during the transitional period in 2020, 2021. There was quite a bit of interest in this idea, and it was even written into the Juba Peace Agreement. There would be some sort of additional court that could try crimes. So there were also some efforts during that period to investigate a particular incident of atrocity crimes from June 3rd against the sit-in protesters in Khartoum. But these efforts did not yield fruit. The whole thing got messed up for reasons that we all saw. But I still put a pin in that because I think it will come back. I think there is an aspiration to have a justice mechanism that people can have confidence in, and that it doesn't have to just be the ICC, because the ICC will only take a few individuals. And that's why I mentioned universal jurisdiction before. And that's why I think we're all mentioning the importance of being a little bit innovative and talking maybe about other things that can be done, at least in the meantime, around documentation. And yeah, there's probably a lot more to say about what can be done now.
Thank you so much all to our speakers for explaining this conflict from various angles, from what evidence gathering and accountability looks like to the horrific humanitarian cost on the ground, particularly for women and girls, and for the role that outside actors have played in prolonging this conflict and putting particularly dangerous weapons in the hands of both sides. I certainly have more questions for everyone, but I've been talking a lot, so I would love to turn it over to our audience now so you can ask questions of our panelists. If you raise your hand, I can call on you and then I'll repeat the questions so that folks attending, our speakers who are attending online, can hear you more easily through the microphone. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Adelaide. I'm a law student at Columbia. I'm interning at the Human Rights Institute this summer. Thank you so much for speaking today. It's been very enlightening. My question is just to follow up on Jihan, what you were just talking about, or I'm not sure if you can hear me, but in the context of universal jurisdiction, if there are specific states involved where you foresee that maybe them bringing charges.
Sure. And just to repeat, so Adelaide spoke about in the context of universal jurisdiction, do you see specific states involved being able to bring forward charges? For Jihan.
Yeah, I mean, well, we know that in other conflict settings, like Syria, for example, that some of the European states have been particularly effective with this, like Germany. The existence of a very active diaspora and a large diaspora in those countries is one helpful ingredient. I'm not hearing about that happening right now with Sudan. Other people on the panel may. But I will flag that many people have talked about other African countries because neighboring countries do have universal jurisdiction on the books. There's just this very complicating factor of the fact that the external actors, including all of Sudan's neighbors, have somehow had picked sides, have somehow become involved in the conflict. So for there to, it's unlikely that, I think it's quite likely that there would be political complications in those countries. But anyway, to the point, I think your question also goes to sort of what do you need? So some countries don't need the presence of a perpetrator or a survivor, but most countries do. And ultimately, it is the discretion of the prosecutor, even in the most wide-ranging liberal universal jurisdiction statutes. It's still up to the prosecutor to decide whether or not to take the case. And that's why things like a very active diaspora presence is useful to really press for the prosecutor to use that discretion to take the case. But all of this assumes that there is a very strong dossier that has been created by investigators. And I can say that we're aware of many groups having been, documenting cases and investigating through the years, and many journalists have been really great with some of the investigative reports that have been so helpful. But any prosecutor is also going to need to have access to survivors to interview and so forth. So there are a lot of reasons why it's difficult and complex. So that maybe that doesn't quite answer your question, but I'm not going to say that there's an obvious answer as to which state should do it. I'm going to say there are many states that have the right tools and the right laws on the books to do it, and that practicalities and political considerations are determinative.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Right, I've got a question. This is directed specifically to Yale Humanitarian Research Lab and Olivia, but I'd be glad to hear from anyone on the panel. I'd like to speak about social media in evidence gathering in Sudan's conflict. The RSF specifically filmed the atrocities it committed in Al-Fashir. Does this type of documentation in some ways make it easier to identify perpetrators of specific abuses? Or on the other hand, does it create a stream of misinformation, or at least difficult to identify, difficult to verify information in our digital age?
I think the simple answer is yes to both parts of those questions. So social media and the prevalence of conflict actors recording themselves committing abuses provides a very strong evidence base for individual acts of violence. That's very important, especially when in events like the fall of Al-Fashir, when the individual acts of violence were systematic across both the number of perpetrators of rapid support forces, soldiers killing, attacking civilians, and the pattern of repeated offenders. And so there were people, including a lieutenant, I believe a lieutenant level rapid support forces member named Abu Lulu, who became quite infamous for his role in Al-Fashir. Some of the challenges, though, that come with that is that typically the folks who are doing the documentation themselves committing mass atrocities are in the lower levels of these command networks. And so this points to something that Jahan has been mentioning, which is the number of individuals who are included in these broader accountability. They may not reach the top levels of the rapid support forces or the standard forces, or those who are responsible for creating the conditions and the systematic violence overall. And so we see this in particular in Al-Fashir, where the role of major commanders, such as the Dagalo brothers, themselves are maybe more challenging to link to the broader pattern of violence. And that's where the other components of our research comes in, including the satellite imagery analysis. So it's the geospatial pattern of those overall attacks, of the attacks that have taken place over time, over the sophistication of the types of violence that we've seen in a sustained way that have served to cut off and destroy a city and kill all the people inside. That allows us to move not only from the individual level, but move closer and closer towards building an evidence and accountability basis against the commanders and those at the top of these warring parties.
Thank you so much. All of our speakers, but I have Kaskondi and Nemat in particular, you spoke so powerfully to the humanitarian situation on the ground, specifically in Darfur. I think it's well worth noting that this means that people are experiencing repeated trauma. So if you survived the genocide in 2003, 2004, you are now experiencing another genocide or case of crimes of genocide, hallmarks of genocide, whatever language you want to use. What types of interventions do you think are necessary in order to address this type of repeated trauma? And again, anyone is free to answer this.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenge for this is the continuation of the patterns of the atrocities, and this is exactly like what Jehan mentioned on the issue of expanding the jurisdiction to Sudan or to Darfur. You will see that it's almost, if you see the types and the faces, that the names that frequently repeated. In 2003, Darfur cases are the same names now currently, either in the south side or in other safe sides that are there. So the pattern's almost similar. Maybe people who weren't born at that time, like Bululu, were not part of 2002, 2003. But I think the biggest challenge of dealing for trauma is for those who are trapped in a conflict area like in Darfur, where it becomes part of your life. You don't actually be able to recognize it. That's because, and also you don't have a vision of when this is going to end. That is becoming very, very chronic, where you have all community people live in a sort of psychosis of fear. And that is, I think that's the biggest challenge. The people who are currently, for instance, in cities like Zalingi, the cities like, Niala, where you see in any moment, like you spend any hour of your life, like this is the last if you make it to the next. And I think, and that you don't know when this is going to end. And you don't know how to even be able to move out of there to somewhere else. I think that is the biggest where you have a normalized trauma, where you have a large number of population living in this risky situation for a long time, but also they don't know when it's going to end. And I think some of the biggest fear for us, for the collective, large group trauma, is that it's very hard to have a perspective of healing it before recognizing it. And it's hard to recognize it when you are actually inside it, because you need to stay outside to experience other conditions before that. And this is, we will see, for instance, people who fled from the war, and came out of a conflict area, like Darfuris who fled to Kampala, for instance. There were those who have crossed the border, stayed long, and then crossed the border to Chad. So I think trauma is very real, particularly people who are living in this situation. I think most of the biggest challenge is that we don't have mechanisms of dealing with this, not at local level. International level, there is some sort of trying to recognize this challenge, but it's very difficult. I think the biggest also the people who are working on this aspect, and this is Sudanese or international. If you are working in a case like what is happening in Sudan, you can actually start feeling it. Imagine somebody who actually wants it. So I think trauma is the biggest challenge to deal with, and I have no idea how to.
Thank you. It's certainly not an easy question. I've seen your hand is raised in Zoom. Do you have a response to what types of interventions are necessary to address this type of repeated or generational trauma?
Well, thank you. I think that's a very important question. I think addressing trauma is like unprecedented trauma that the people in Darfur, and also not to forget South Kordofan and the Blue Nile, these two areas has been part of the early struggle of South Sudan in the face of the South Sudan breaking away. This group have been re-victimized by putting Ahmed Haroun in charge, a man who's also wanted for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Darfur. So you can imagine these people like always having this hope that there will be a day that they will go home. The reason our people is stuck into this internal displaced camps, like if they knew that there would be another war, they would have fled to Libya when they have interviewed. They would have fled to Chad or Central African Republic, or even far more than the places. But unfortunately, people were hopeful. And being in your land is a part of like kind of the identity and the dignity that you have, and that is what kept these people together. And seeing things like the attack in Zamzam and the attack in Abu Shuk and all these camps that have been dismantled and the camps in Al Junaina, it's still the type of trauma that you will remain living with it for the rest of your life. I've been to Kurdistan, Iraq, where they are living in post-conflict situation, and it is so fascinating to see, like, I walk into offices of like ministers and commissioners, and the moment they knew that I'm from Darfur, they will start telling you the stories of their survival and how they have been through genocide, but that genocide will never be recognized. So you can imagine like how many years it takes people to just be able to tell their stories, because they never been allowed that Saddam Hussein was like taken away, and then they were told us like, you just rebuild your life, and that's it. There hasn't been any like trauma counseling that provided to groups or people who are like maybe in a position of power, let alone people who still are survivors and being re-victimized. So I cannot begin to describe the level of trauma, and especially for victims of sexual and gender-based violence. I think there's always hope, and there are like tools and ways that we ourselves have been thinking this through as we work in this every day. Like empowering the survivors is one of the biggest, like these are like fundamental principle or founding of our organization, is that if we want to end genocide sustainably, genocide doesn't happen in an overnight. It takes long layers of like creating the condition for the last stage of genocide, which is the killing and the displacement, so that it takes marginalization, it takes disenfranchisement, it takes undermining, demeaning, so that the perpetrator is so well put in position to kill the other person without feeling any remorse, because these people deserve to be treated this way. In order to reverse that, so you need to bring these people who have been historically marginalized and pushed away from decision-making centers to be able to decide for the future of Sudan or Darfur or wherever they are. So that is one of them. I know it is hard, and it may not resonate with many who are doing intervention, quick fix intervention and then move on. So that is what we see, that empowering survivors to be able to be a part of change making in Sudan is the #1 priority. 2, like prioritizing women leadership. When the attack is targeted on women, it is not in vain, it is not something happen randomly, it is very systematic, because women in Sudan are the glue that hold the community together, and especially in the Darfur. And there is an analysis being done by the Bashir regime that why the Darfur don't flee, they don't, and they continue to resist, because they have strong women who hold the community together. And this goes back to the history of Darfur when they fought the colonial. I don't want to go to that, but that is kind of why women are so systematically targeted, and that's why in a form of resistance we want to promote women leadership, women issues. Another priority that we set to advocate for taking an atrocity prevention approach to Sudan. The issue has been, it's like the perpetrator kill people and then they tomorrow come, because the approach to Sudan has been very traditional, using traditional conflict resolution mechanism, when there is nothing traditional about genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and especially when it is repeated by the same actors. So what we are advocating is that we start by accountability, holding those actors accountable. We don't say kill them or fight against them, at least take them and put them in court. We have seen how it worked in Liberia, we have seen how it worked in Rwanda. So at least those who are more responsible, if they are taken away to face justice, justice gives dignity to both perpetrator and the victims. So that is the way to show the Sudanese people that if they disagree, they do not need to pick arms to fight. They need to go to court where both peacefully can articulate their position and get. So in a real world, it's hard. Barriers to justice as of today is that most of those so-called talking about civilian government, now they become an umbrella, political umbrella for RSF, because most of those who were part of the transitional government, unfortunately, right now, fooling the international community, advocating about the return of the civilian government, is there because they never condemn the RSF for all this, including like Sumu, Tegadum, whoever, like so many actors. And then also part of the Bashir regime are still in, like Port Sudan or Khartoum. So these are the barriers to accountability. And the more they are given the control over whatever political settlement, then crises, crimes in Sudan become unevitable because they will make sure that peace are not allowed to be implemented. And we have seen that the Darfur peace agreement, Juba peace agreement, South Sudan peace agreement or referendum, everything is falling apart. And that is why, for once, we advocate strongly that atrocity prevention and gender-sensitive atrocity prevention need to be taken like approach to Sudan, starting by accountability. Like for instance, right now, what it needed on the ground is civilian protection first, and creating enabling environment for people to receive aid, then pursuing accountability, documenting atrocities and making sure that there is accountability so the perpetrator knows even when they go to peace, then this will create an enabling environment for political settlement. And when that political settlement came, then like ICC is the starting point. Right now there's no other mechanism that we can recommend. ICC is the starting point. Then even when ICC, like for instance, when ICC make indictment, other countries can use their own instrument to narrow the space. Like for instance, right now we know some advisors of the RSF living in the United States, living in Kenya, living in Europe, but you can't bring a case against them. But if someone is indicted, if someone is held accountable, then this consider like these people who are aiding and abetting these people to commit these crimes, and we can bring cases against them. So those are like areas that, so the universal jurisdiction can't be a complementary, but also many people don't know about it, like especially diaspora living in the West, people are overwhelmed with like helping their own community survive. But I do think if we use all this like justice mechanism, then transitional justice, like as I can quote one of the prominent lawyers said, if there is no transition, there is no transitional justice. And of course, when the war is still happening, the transitional justice can't be manipulated by the perpetrator themselves. And I remember Hemeti liked to talk about transitional justice. In his context, he think of forgiveness, like thank you, go, let us forget, move on. These are like serious discussion and serious conversation that need to happen. And we have to shift the thinking of actors working on bringing a solution to Sudan. Otherwise, like there will be a negotiation that dominated by the military actors. There's no chances for women, youth, or civil society to bring their voices up on these platforms. And then we have these external actors like UAE and others will dominate the venue, and then the outcome is another like military government and then another crisis. So it takes work, but if we all can collectively work, make our voices stronger. DUAC is working on developing the atrocity prevention framework. Hopefully at some point we'll bring you all together to chip in your 2 cents and making that like a huge advocacy and push for the international community to understand that. So, but the trauma is real. I think starting like some form of justice give people some sort of healing, because it's not about like the long process of getting mental health assistance is very, very important, but it's also feeling recognized, feeling like your plight is being recognized. That is very, very important, especially recognizing in a court of justice. The Ali Koshet case was not satisfactory, but it is important to establish precedences. In Sudan, like this has even informed the Sudanese people from both sides that there is such a thing and that accountability. I think that one of the de facto government justice minister was in the Hague. So this is like kind of a progress in itself. And then for the first time, the Port Sudan government recognized gender-based violence and incident of rape, and they have a very active gender unit. So this would not have been in place without the ICC arrest warrant and also the work that people like us and civil society group, locally led organization do behind the scenes. So I do think there is hope, but there's a lot of work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Naimat, you spoke about the failures of traditional conflict resolution in Sudan. As we look towards what is next in the country, I think it's important to note that, as many in our audience probably know, the United States has engaged in the Quad peace process with Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, which undoubtedly gets many powerful actors in the room, but has drawn skepticism for numerous diplomats and analysts about its ability to actually lead to lasting peace in Sudan. So, Gabriella and Nikki, can you tell us how you see the Quad? Is this a mediation process that can actually be successful by drawing in these outside actors? And I do invite our other speakers to comment on this as well, if you would like.
Thank you for that question. I think, as Naimat pointed out, the important work that happens with conflict resolution is from people who are experiencing the conflict and from people who are actually involved. And so when you have something like the Quad up here, it has its uses, but I think that Gabriella and I remain oftentimes skeptical of such a partnership. I think where the U.S. could be useful, if it has political will to do so, is by curtailing the UAE's and even Saudi Arabia's involvement and support of these actors. I think as close allies of the U.S., both countries specifically, and Egypt as well, and Turkey as a NATO member, the U.S. has considerable influence with those countries. And so if it were to really kind of put pressure and put its political force behind attempting to get these countries to curtail its weapons supply, its monetary support of these organizations, then that could be where the U.S. is useful. But I don't know that the U.S. has this political will at the moment. It's not necessarily very fashionable for the U.S. To get involved in humanitarian crises. And specifically, this administration often has a roving eye when it comes to global crises and is focused on the Iran war and has also turned its focus to Latin America. And so in many ways, Sudan is forgotten amongst U.S. policymakers. There are certain U.S. Republican policymakers who are passionate about the Sudanese conflict, but I do remain skeptical about how much the U.S. can actually, how much will the U.S. has, because if it does, it can affect change in some ways. I don't know, Gabby, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I would agree with your points on that. I think, everyone in this room could confidently say that diplomatic efforts so far have failed. Nikki did mention that there had been some interest in the U.S., particularly, I think it was last September, that the Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, had mentioned that the Quad would be reactivating and talking. And I know that Trump's senior advisor on Africa restarted negotiations via the Quad in February. But whatever sort of resolutions or discussions that had come out of that are not being seen on the ground in Sudan. The U.S. Treasury Department has sanctioned Hamedi and several Emirati holding companies that have sustained the flow of weapons to the RSF, which I think is something, but it's not enough. And I think it's important that the Quad exists to hold these conversations, but at the same time, the irony of the actors that are sustaining the war are the ones that are in this peace resolution group. So I think that as long as the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt is interested in sustaining the war, that I don't foresee much coming from that, unfortunately.
Thank you both again for your answers. We have limited time left, so does anyone in attendance have any questions for our speakers? Yeah, go ahead.
Yona Diamond with Employers Walker Center. I just want to ask that despite all of the well-known documentation of the RSF supply lines running from the UAE, high-level actors and officials still kind of accept the UAE's line, full denial that they back the RSF. I wonder if anyone has ideas as to how they could still kind of get away with that.
And I'll just repeat into the microphone for folks attending via Zoom. The question was, diplomats, high-profile folks will buy the UAE line, that it is not actually supporting the RSF. Why do people think that is still happening? And I believe that's for anyone who wants to answer.
Yeah, I think I can just jump up on here. I think, and there's also the bigger question about why we have 3 years without any successful diplomatic pressure for peace. And this holds true in every context. As much as the war is profitable, nobody go and look for peace. And I think this is exactly the context, what Sudan context of too tells us about the war, reluctant of having a peace agreement. The UAE has, it is a strategic investment. It is very huge. Deposit of gold, but we are not talking about gold when we are talking about Sudan now. Sudan into our lives, especially people in the Western world, more than everyone thinks. Sudan is inside your makeup, all the cosmetic, pills, of the tablets of medicine you swallow, beer you drink, pastry you get when you go to the cafe. It's all the Arabic gum coming from Sudan. So beyond the gold, there is other things. And I think for the armed actors to agree to peace, for the UAE to stay away from stopping this without increasing the cost of what they are doing, as far as the cost is, the interest is higher than the cost, they will continue doing. And I think there's a lot of global movement to boycott, to pressure UAE, which is everyone can do in their phones, everywhere where you are, let them know the world sees what they're doing. But I think there is some more to be done, especially by the international mechanism, in which U.S. can be a very key crucialist, as well as the United Nations and other like EU agencies, by following the money. Close the taps wherever it is, because, and I'm telling this for the example, I was in Uganda for 7 years, and that time, like 10 years ago, like all this armed movement were in Kampala doing some sort of agreements and coalitions. And I have one of, the guy who was from Darfur, he was an army actor leader, very commander, like somebody who wouldn't talk to people. It's like untouchable. And suddenly, this person would just become so normal and doesn't exist even like, and I don't know what happens. Say money, means he's been dismissed from the movement and he lost the money and he become a normal person from that people. And I think that is exactly the scenario how it's, if you close the tap, if you make the war more possible, no interest, no benefit from these people who are waging the war, they have only two options. They will come crawling for a peace or they will self-destroy. But as far as the war become more interesting, more profitable, they will have being able to sell, in the political market. So elites, organizations sell estates, buy estates, neighboring estate, pay for, tribal leaders who can forcibly recruit, the same as in the south side as well, because especially Egypt, when we are talking about Egypt, the relationship with South, because most of the Sudan export now it become an Egypt export, and Egyptian military plays key role into that, has a lot of huge interest. And I think following some of those and being able to close those tabs are very key into, reframing the balance of power, the interests of the war, but also the diplomatic influence on this. And I think, this is what at least can give some hope for people in Sudan.
Thank you so much. We're just about at time because 2 hours is quite obviously not enough time to speak about Sudan. But I would love our panelists to close by just, if you can say in a sentence or two, something that you hope people take away from this wide-ranging discussion, whether it's following the money, the importance of accountability, any one thing that you wish people would take away, I'd like to hear from our panelists. We'll go in the order that we spoke, so we'll start with you, Namat, then Kaskondi, Olivia, our friends from the Sufan Center, and finally, Jihan. So Namat, why don't you begin? What's one thing you hope that people take away?
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, our audience in the room and online. I think one thing that people can take about is that the people of Sudan, especially civil society group, women-led organization, affected community-led organization, they never cease the moment to amaze us at how resilient, how determined they are. And they told us that hope is possible even in the face of unimaginable adversity. So empowering the people of Sudan, I think solution to the problems of Sudan lies on the people of Sudan, but we also need everyone's help, and we need to create political will, and internationally, regionally. And at the moment, there's a huge gap in advocacy, especially dedicated advocacy, as it has been done before across countries. Many people have criticized the Save Darfur movement, but right now we're crying for that Save Darfur type of movement that where citizens, individual activists, advocates goes, march and talk to their representative, including here in the United States. There hasn't been enough grassroots advocacy being done, especially given the role currently the U.S. taking with the Quad. I think we need a lot of work to create that political will, but also to make sure that the administration get it right. So I think speaking up, advocating, showing the people of Sudan that they are not alone, but empowering and supporting those on the ground fighting every day to give hope is very, very important, and not advocating just to government officials, but also to donors, to member states, and to all international organizations to partner and empower those people, because they are the only ones who remain there to work for and help their people forever. Thank you.
Kaskondi?
Yeah, I think talking about the artisticness of Sudanese and trauma and healing and collective healing, just resharing a story. So people started coming back to Khartoum after they ran in a very horrible time when the war happened. So this is a man in his 60s, and he's one of the people who, when his family just go, you run. I am not leaving Khartoum. I'm born here in this neighborhood. I know every tree, everything. I'm not going. So he remained there. I think after a month, the war so much intensified, sharing everywhere, and he decided to leave. So he took a small saggy bag, so he's not to pull attention, and he was running on the wall, and then he saw somebody who was riding a bike coming, and he said, "Okay, I will try my luck. If he's armed, he'll kill me. If he is not armed, he can take me out of this war." And then the guy has come close. He kind of spoke with some accent, and the guy understand. And he rides a bike, but the person was running 200 kilometers because it's a war. The shootings going this side and this side. And then when they are going, they are actually getting out of the area, and this person is just moving faster. And he told him please slow down, my eyes are falling, I cannot see. And I said, why don't you do like I am doing? He said, what are you doing? Close the eyes. He said, just close the eyes and let's go. So he realized that this guy in all this speed was closing the eyes, he's not even seeing. So I would just want to say that, it is very dark in Sudan. We are just closing the eyes and driving all this through. And I think it is important at least to understand where we learn which highway Sudan is taking, it is really rough. And I think some of those stories people sharing on after the war is like kind of, you see how people love, how people even such terrible experience, people can reshape it to sit down and tell what happens to you, and they laugh, and then this one tells. And I think that is the art of people's resilience, how people make it. And I saw in Nuba Mountain, when the aerial bombardment was very intensified in 2013, 2012, 2013, people are actually taking the bombshell and make music instrument and remain. So I think that is the resilience which Sudanese survive on. And I think, I believe that one day this will also be history. But I think, any support at this moment, talking about Sudan, increase the visibility of what is happening, every work you do matters so much into making that day closer. So thank you.
Thank you. Lydia?
I can't echo nearly as eloquently the words of Kasonde and Nemat on the acts of just survival being resistance, of continuing to build community being resistance, but I think that amidst the worst forms of atrocity potentially ever seen amongst humanity, you're seeing also some of the strongest acts of bravery that are very simply just survival at times and maintaining community. And I think that's something that has consistently stuck with me, and I'd like to thank you both especially for sharing those words today. I think the other component, and I don't know if this is super helpful, but political will is something that is very powerful, and it's also something that's very much missing in this context in an international sense. And so while I'm not making a statement about Western hegemony, the role that the United States, that Britain have had in not condemning these atrocities, in not, as reflected by many folks here, in not preventing the foreign powers from engaging in this war, it wouldn't be particularly challenging for them to just say no, issue sanctions. That's not a major challenge, but it is something that requires a level of political will and backbone that we have not seen across multiple administrations in both the United States and in Britain in particular.
Thank you. And then finally, Gabriella. Or both of you, feel free.
Something that I had wanted to discuss in my previous remarks that I'll try to emphasize now, which is not as hopeful as my fellow panelists have emphasized in terms of the resilience of the Sudanese people. Unfortunately, is not something that I touch upon so much in my research, but something that the Sudan Center does focus a lot on are terrorist groups. And so I also just want to emphasize that the longer this war goes on, the more space that there are for other malign actors. And at the Sudan Center, we focus a lot on Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, and reports have indicated that both groups have urged their fighters to join the conflict in Sudan in an effort to establish strongholds there. And as we've seen in other regions in Africa, neighboring the Sahel, these groups have had quite an effect, especially on the humanitarian aspect. And so a takeaway I would like to propose is to have these actors also in the back of our minds when we're thinking about the future of this conflict.
Yeah, and in thinking about that, I don't want to take up too much time, but as Nemat kind of so eloquently said, that this issue domestically within Sudan is an international issue, and there are always complexities with U.S. advocacy or the Save Darfur movement, but attention within the U.S. towards this conflict and advocacy by U.S. citizens can help to alleviate at least the pressure that the external actors place on the RSF and the SAF. And as Gabby stated, as conflict wages on, people can only respond so much. People become radicalized. groups can take advantage. The borders in the neighboring countries are porous, and as many of the countries have taken a side around Sudan, take one because they know that the conflict can spill over, and not just within Africa, but this conflict is important in the West as well, and I think we should all remember that.
Thank you. Is Jihan still with us?
I am still here, but I gotta say, I think everybody else's words have been, I mean, I can't possibly add. I think it's all been said, and I'm just really glad to continue to do events on Sudan. This is important, so thank you for organizing it.
Of course. I'll just close by saying please keep your eyes on Sudan and on the work of our amazing panelists, and thank you so